Xenosign. It's actually just after you're born that life flashes before your eyes. Entire eons are lived in those first few months when you feel inseparable from the world itself, with nothing to do but watch it passing by. At first, time is only felt vicariously, as something that happens to other people. You get used to living in the moment because there's nowhere else to go. But soon enough, life begins to move, and you learn to move with it. And you take it for granted that you're a different person every year, upgraded with a different body, a different future. You run around so fast, the world around you seems to stand still, until a summer vacation can stretch on for an eternity. And you start to feel time moving forward, learning its rhythm. But now and then it skips a beat, as if your birthday arrives one day earlier every year. We should consider the idea that youth is not wasted on the young, that their dramas are no more grand than they should be, that their emotions make perfect sense once you adjust for inflation. So for someone going through adolescence, life feels epic and tragic simply because it is. Every kink in your day could easily warp the arc of your story, because each year is worth a little less than the last. And with each birthday, we circle back and cross the same point around the sun, and wish each other many happy returns. But soon you feel the circle begin to tighten, and you realize it's a spiral, and you're already halfway through. As more of your day repeats itself, you start to cast off dead weight, and feel the steady pull toward your center of gravity, the ballast of memories you hold on to, until it all seems to move under its own inertia. So even when you sit still, it feels like you're running somewhere. And even if tomorrow you'll run a little faster and stretch your arms a little farther, you'll still feel the seconds slipping away as you drift around the bend. Life is short and life is long, but not in that order.
So I was about 7 years old, right? When this guy over here, that's coming up in just a second, this guy decided to pull me aside, oh, yikes, and have a serious conversation with me. And though it would be tough to take my dad seriously after looking at this picture, or pretty much ever since, that was a conversation that kind of set the course of my story. You see, at that time, my dad was barely home, and sometimes I would only really get to see him for kind of like the weekend out of a month. And I hated it. He hated it. So he pulled me aside and said something along the lines, "Son, I hope you know that I wish I could spend more time with you and your mother." Clara wasn't around yet. Those were good times. But you see, I have to work hard to put food on the table. The reason for that is that I didn't have an education. The education required to have a job that would allow me to be with you and provide for you. But you see, one day you will also fall in love with a woman. You will want to give her the world. One day you will also have a kid and want to spend as much time as you can with him. So work hard now. Study hard now, so when that day comes, you can take care of your family without having to compromise time with them. That conversation changed everything. From that point on, up into college, I was a straight-A student. That was the reason why I quit soccer when I went to college. Instead of rehabbing injuries, I wanted to focus on my studies. That was also the reason why, when all the friends that I had that went on to play music professionally, I chose to instead become a financial analyst. But fast forward a few years. I met Ashley. You see, we went to church together, and she was one of my best friends there, even though we were 4 years apart in age. And as our friendship developed, my role in her life was kind of that of a big brother to keep her out of trouble. I stayed in touch with her even when I went off to college. And every time I was back in town, I made sure we caught up. Now, to make a long story a little bit shorter, one day, I went back to Cleveland to lead worship, and this is what I encountered. Bam. Yeah, I did. You see, she had become my peer now. And it was more than just looks, right? It was spiritually, intellectually, immaturity. Although I'm going to say she was pretty hot. The problem is, oh, no, I'm going ahead of myself. We didn't know how to act on this, simply because I was a senior in college and I was about to move to San Francisco. But the problem is that I was completely in love. So we decided to try the long distance thing. And it was great. And we even started, and she even came to come visit me in San Francisco. But I realized that the truth is I don't know how to do this long distance thing. So I moved to Pittsburgh. Fast forward 6 months, and I did something I found to be utterly irresponsible. We went to San Francisco to visit my family for Christmas. I took her to my favorite beach at a time that I knew there wouldn't be anybody there. It was sunset. And let's just say I put a ring on it. Yeah, I did. So we set the date for the wedding and had just about finished preparations for it. Unfortunately, though, a few months had passed, and Ashley was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, which is a form of cancer. So for that reason, we postponed our wedding. So she went through the treatment, she had surgery, she had recovery, which included relearning how to walk, until finally, after much pain and suffering, she was deemed cancer-free. We timed things so that when Ashley could regain her strength, we would get married as soon as possible. And I just kind of want to share some pictures with you guys. Because quite honestly, it was the best day of my life. And when I say a few pictures, you guys are going to have to bear with me, okay? Because you probably thought I was going to talk about Jesus or something, but nah. Because we have another one. And another one. And another one. And even one of our honeymoon. You see, survival rate for Ewing sarcoma, provided it's localized, is of about around 85%. So we were ready to move our life forward. And once again, some people thought it might have been a little bit soon for this, but we decided that it was time to have our first child. Unfortunately for us, though, the silliness in our dreams had both to be put on hold because 3 months after our wedding, Ashley's doctors found evidence of the disease in her lungs. You see, whereas localized Ewing's has a pretty good prognosis, that cannot be said about metastasized Ewing's. Metastasized simply means that it's no longer in its original spot. So the 2.5 years of our marriage were going to have to be us going from one clinical trial to the next to try and find anything that would work for her. And this is the one that we went at NIH, National Institute of Health. And in case you didn't know, extended visitor to them means you pretty much live there. And in this case, the orange tube was actually the chemo. Oh, I skipped one, my bad. The orange tube was actually the chemo that she was taking, so she decided to make the most of that. And along the lines of making the most of things, let's back up. During this process, actually, I met a lot of special kids. I met kids going through all kinds of hell, quite honestly, be it cancer. There was one kid that was schizophrenic. And through meeting all these guys, there's one specific that I want to show you guys because he is probably one of the primary reasons why I decided to quit my job as a financial analyst to pursue, hopefully, one day to become a pediatric oncologist. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Ashley had a way of trying to make the best of her situations. And she would always say, cancer took so much from her that she would decided to take a little bit back. So whenever she saw an opportunity to really milk the system, she would take her wig off, put no makeup on, and that's how we met Chip and Joanna. In case you don't know, these guys are a big deal back at home. And through it all, though, I must say, we always believed we're going to get through this. We got these tattoos together. Now, eventually, her doctor found a combination of chemotherapy that kept her disease at bay. You see, it worked for about a year. When one day, for weekend of the 4th of July, we were going to go out into a lake house, and for the weekend, when on that Thursday I got home and actually looked really swollen. And so we got a little concerned, but figured it was just, I don't know, some allergic reaction or something. But it wasn't getting better throughout the day. And I knew that I had to do some financials for work. It was month-end close, so I needed to do the budget forecasting, market analysis, all that nonsense, right? So I asked her parents to come and spend the night at our house and to stay there the next day while I was at work. But that morning, she looked worse. She was significantly more swollen, and by the time I got home from work, she had veins popping out of her chest that we were not accustomed to seeing. And at that point, I just kind of wanted to take her to the hospital. She didn't want to go, though, so we kind of waited another day into Saturday morning. And at that point, things were really starting to get scary, and how she was looking physically. And quite honestly, I was freaking out. Not a little bit, a lot of it. And I told her, Ash, I need to take you to the hospital. But you see, she didn't want to go. We pretty much lived at the hospital. She had an appointment on Monday. She thought it could just wait. And also because it was July 4th weekend, she would have to go to the ER rather than the cancer unit. So she just didn't want to go. But the situation was serious. And I kind of had my husband of the year moment when I pretty much, I just looked at her and I was like, Ashley, you're either going to come with me or I'm going to pick you up and take you myself because this is serious. I'm not leaving you home. And free marriage advice for all the gentlemen in the room, don't do that. So she angrily went to the car just so I could take her to the ER, right? On the way there, I was driving fast, even though it wasn't far. I wanted to get her there ASAP. And she felt nauseated. And she told me, she was screaming at me, quite honestly, at the time, to stop the car because she needed to throw up. And I said, no, I'm not stopping this car. I'm getting you to the hospital. You can throw up in the car if you want. I don't care. You see, in my mind, I was being a hero, right? I was making the difficult decisions of pissing off my wife, or making my wife really angry in order to save her life. I'm sorry. But in her mind, I was being an abusive jerk who threatened force in order to take away her control over the situation. Well, that night, she was discharged erroneously by the emergency department with allergy medication. But this fight continued for the rest of the weekend. On Monday, she was supposed to get chemo, but upon seeing her, her oncologist knew that this was no allergic reaction, so she was immediately admitted to the hospital. And our fight continued. That night, we went to sleep at the hospital, and even though we were sharing that tiny hospital bed, we were really not on the best of terms yet. But at last, we fall asleep, and the next thing I remember is the nurse waking me up saying, Ramon, Ashley is not responding. She's not waking up. It's time for you to call your family because I don't think she's going to make it through the night. And I turned around to see that Ashley had foam drool everywhere, and no matter what the nursing staff did, she was simply unresponsive. So I called the family and we just started to pray. And throughout that day, as her vitals started to fade, her breathing slowed down to what would eventually become about one breath every 3 minutes. And the doctors came out to say their goodbyes in case she could still hear them. And at that time, I came to two simultaneously desperate realizations. Number one, and most obvious, my wife was dying. But number two is that we were still fighting. You see, I had never had the opportunity to tell her how much of a jerk I had been and that I was sorry. I never got to tell her that I was so afraid of losing her that I acted in a way that was simply unacceptable. I realized that it had probably been longer than 3 days since I had kissed her or that I had told her I loved her. And I realized that I would never have the opportunity to make that right. She was going to die not feeling my love. So I walked out of the room for a minute. I had some things I needed to tend to, probably work. When Clara came out running to tell me that Ashley was awake. That moment I realized that I had been given a miraculous gift. In case you don't believe in miracles, that was a miracle. And it was one that most people don't get. And I made sure that with every opportunity I told her that I loved her, I apologized, and I broke just about every single hospital rule to make sure that she had what she needed in order to make her happy. And that may or may not have included bringing the cat hidden into the room. A little bit over a month later, though, we were still at the hospital when on August 16th of 2015, her body finally gave out and she went home to be with the Lord. The interesting thing is that on the last night when she was still conscious, we had a significantly different experience than that which I just described. You see, she was in bed for so long and she was really weak, so she couldn't really move anymore, right? Her joints had gotten stiff even though she was awake. And but on that final night, as I was once again sneaking my way in through all the tubes and the IV, and she was intubated at this moment, so she had a tube coming out of her mouth, to lay down to sleep, she looked at me, and once again, even though she was intubated, she kind of made her way to do like one of those crooked smiles so I could see it. And she mustered up all her strength, and she kind of threw her arm and leg on top of me. And we just kind of held ourselves there until we fell asleep. And that was the last interaction I had with her while she was conscious. And in case you didn't know, her death and the fact that my family lives here in Miami is the reason why I moved here. And as I share my story with you, I cannot help but to think of this verse. So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. But before I move on, I want to address something. You see, since the Bible is a compilation of books put together from different authors over the course of thousands of years, it's an easy book to take out of context. And people have been doing this for years, right? Wars have been started this way. Racism and murder have been excused by that, and I refuse to do it. So I'm going to be addressing a few verses and pulling up one-liners from them. So I want to put them up right now so that you can take a picture of it if you want, so that you can confirm the context of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to do that if you need. And the awkward silence. All right, back to the verse. You see, we as humans are really, really good at losing sight of our own mortality. I would argue, and I think Moses, the writer of the 90th Psalm, would absolutely agree that this is the source of much of our lack of proper perspective when living out in the real world. We tend to live out as though tomorrow was a guarantee, which would suggest that our present conditions and decisions, if bad, can be addressed tomorrow. We procrastinate until pressed for time, not realizing that we will not likely know when our time is coming short until it's too late. And that's utterly foolish of us to do. We must learn to count our days that we may gain the heart of wisdom. And King David had also become increasingly aware of this reality when in Psalm 39 he prayed and lamented this: "O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days but a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath." The bottom line here is this: since the day you were born, with each and every breath, with each day that has passed by, you're one day closer to death. And the worst part is you won't know what day that will be. And actually, there's a saying that goes something like this: live every day as though it was your last, and one day you'll certainly be right. And I think Paul addresses this in his letter to the Ephesians when he says, "Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil." Listen, time's short. Life is fleeting. It is so unpredictable. So I want to challenge you to be intentional with it. Especially, and specifically, I want to challenge you to be intentional with it when it comes to regards to loving one another. In 1 Corinthians 13, Paul explains why this is the most important area, I believe, where we must be intentional. He says this: "If I speak the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong, a clanking cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have and deliver up my body to be burned but have not love, I gain nothing." There's one more. "So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love." So love. Love each other romantically and otherwise. Love each other unashamedly and fully. Love one another sacrificially. Love one another not just in word but in deed. Because you might not get a chance to do it tomorrow. And here is what our love should look like. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant nor rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. We are called to love one another with the same kind of selfless devotion that led Christ to the cross for people, for me, for you, many of whom would reject him immediately. And this is the agape love we have been talking about all month. But listen, I still struggle with this, right? You would think that after my dramatic experience with Ashley, I would just get it. Pero no. I don't. I fail at having this perspective. I fail at it during arguments, as Claude and my dad can probably vouch for. I failed at it. This past weekend, I realized that I failed at this when I procrastinated on talking about Christ with a close friend, Erin, who had been dealing with Ewing sarcoma as well. You see, she passed away this past Sunday, and I never intentionally shared the hope of Christ with her, at least not directly. So when I share this with you, please don't think that I have it all figured out by any stretch of the imagination. I'm preaching at myself about this, but the reality remains. Because the call here is to reckless abandonment when loving people. When you love this way, you don't have time to play games and wait for the other person to reciprocate your love before you show that love. There's no time to waste. And I'm not just talking about romantic relationships, but the problem arises because, see, this kind of love leads to a certain level of vulnerability, which is really uncomfortable. We may get hurt. But that reality, quite honestly, always brings me back to the cross. I feel like in this discomfort, I gain an ever slightly better perspective on how infinitely vulnerable our eternal God became in order to make us his own. And that is the beauty of his love. And quite honestly, I find it to be very much worth it on the human level as well. I can tell you that it is better to have loved and lost, much better to have loved and lost than to not have loved at all. And in case you thought I would be able to go through a whole talk without quoting either Tim Keller or C.S. Lewis, well, here we go. Because I think C.S. Lewis does a good job addressing this. He says, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in a casket or a coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. So be vulnerable. Love one another intentionally, fully, selflessly, recklessly, because time's of the essence. Let's pray.